So last week, as we began our 40-day journey to Easter, I talked about the ancient wisdom from our Jewish ancestors that the road from creation to redemption is not a straight line. I talked about it being a zigzag. And we forget our story on that road. We believe our own forms of fake news. We get in trouble. We get off the path and we hurt people we love, and we may even hurt ourselves in our quest to find the promised land. We are lured into imagining that with the right clothes, the right accent, the right school, the right clubs, we will find ourselves just a little bit closer to the good life and the kingdom of heaven. And it doesn't matter what it costs in human sacrifice and suffering to make those designer tennis shoes, we must have them. And our lives begin to focus on the exterior, how we appear, being part of the A crowd, kind of social Darwinism, the survival of the strongest, the most sophisticated, or whatever. And we find ourselves worshiping in the temple of consumerism, bedazzled and distracted for a while, filling up the void inside all of us until the next sparkling object demands our attention. This week I found myself watching a lot of news, tuning in and out of the news. And it was wonderful to see those smiling faces winning gold and silver medals, and all you think of, from their little children and the sacrifices and all the things that they're, and so you have all this joy and sense of breaking barriers and records and human achievement. And then watching the president meeting with survivors of gun violence at the White House. And there was a young man in particular who talked about texting his family and friends thinking that he was going to die. And that was just a very powerful image. And then, I think the same day, flicking the channel, watching the vice president of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, responding to the same incident. And he talks about the need to have more guns to protect people on the streets. And even the president suggesting that maybe teachers with a military background or familiar with guns need to be armed to protect our children. And LaPierre said a very interesting thing. He said, we guard our jewelry stores. We have armed guards at our jewelry stores and at our banks, and we don't value our children as much as we do these possessions. And there was a kind of logic in his argument. And he talked about, why should we depend on legislation to change what's going on in our country, because people aren't keeping the law anyway. And he cites a whole lot of stuff from immigration to opioid addiction. And again, there's a kind of rationale and logic to what he's talking about. But it became clear to me that people who are going to rob a bank or a jewelry store, they want the loot. They're not going deliberately to kill a bunch of people. And so it's a different kind of story. But what I saw in that kind of flicking the channel was, we are living on different planets. We have completely different narratives of reality. And what are we going to do if law and order cannot be upheld? How do we protect the things we value, our institutions? And so on. And then later on in the week, Poland is passing laws that make it illegal to talk badly about the Polish involvement in the Holocaust. You can be fined or go to prison. And then watching the Assad Syrian regime in Russia conducting aerial bombings of civilians in Ghouta, while the UN sits on its hands. And an interesting appeal from the international medical community was published this week in The Lancet, and they said, inaction in the face of unrelenting attacks on civilians represent an epic failure of world leaders. The appeal said it condemns patterns of attacks which predominantly target civilian areas and demonstrate a position that all civilians in opposition-held areas are legitimate targets. So that is kind of our world, from creation to redemption. It's a reminder that the road to redemption is a zigzag. It's not a straight line. And we all participate in this very dysfunctional and duplicitous society that has created many of these examples that I'm citing. The competing dreams, the levels of denial. It's not our problem, it's their problem. And if only we paid more attention to this or locked up those people, we all might feel a little safer, or whatever that means. And in the midst of all of that, we have these three very obscure pieces of scripture that kind of float into our consciousness today. And what can they say to these situations that I am describing? And I begin by saying there are many stories in the Bible where there is an account of not only the times when the human family has gotten lost or off track, but there are also records of how we've gotten back on track. And they pivot on particular people. And what's common in these stories is that it is kind of ordinary, unlikely people that are chosen by God to kind of turn humanity back onto the right path. And we have three examples in the readings today. We've got Abraham and his wife Sarah, don't forget Sarah, Paul, and Jesus. And I want to kind of open up, and they're all connected in the story today, in the readings that we have today on the second Sunday of Lent. And Abraham and Sarah are seen as the founders of the faith movement. But over time, the story of Abraham and Sarah's faith journey is itself corrupted and is used as a weapon against faith and the people of faith. It is used to exclude and to puff up a particular group who hold hostage God's story of salvation. And nobody knows this more than St. Paul himself, who is this kind of fundamentalist Pharisee. And that the story is limited to the Jews only. And Paul realizes that his job intellectually in writing to the church, the early church in Rome, is to kind of claim back the story of Abraham for everybody. And so the second reading today is this argument that he presents about who Abraham and Sarah really were to the faith community. And they weren't just for the Jewish people. And, when Paul was in his kind of fundamentalist rant about, being this perfect Jew, you had the law, you had the commandments to obey, you had the sacrifice to God, and you had, if you were male, you had circumcision. And these were the marks of God's special relationship that God had with God's people. And part of the argument, he says, well, is that really what it means to be the people of God, or is there something else going on? And what he does, he says, basically, Abraham sets out on his journey, and it's only 14 years from the beginning of that journey that he and his family and his servants are circumcised. And then generations after that, they receive the Jewish law. So what was it that is universal, that is kind of bigger than the law and circumcision, that we can all connect with Abraham and his story of faith? And so what he does, he said, the thing that Abraham and Sarah have in common with all of us, all people of faith, is that they set out in faith on a journey not knowing where they're going. And they trust God. They trust God's promise. And in doing that, God promises them that they will be the ancestor of many nations. And that you heard kings and, all this stuff's going to come from the beginning of this faith journey. And so Paul, the context that Paul is writing this letter is that this little early Christian community in Rome was saying, well, maybe you have to be a Jew, maybe you have to be circumcised and observe the Jewish law to be a Christian. And so Paul is kind of reclaiming the story of Abraham in a different context for everybody. And it wasn't circumcision and the law, it was about faith, stepping out in faith, and that all of the nations are blessed in this action of faith. The other thing that Paul does, he takes on this whole thing about law. And I've always found this confusing because when we talk about law, we think about the laws of the state, and we think that somehow Paul is talking about kind of lawlessness, but he's not. He's talking about that law. The thing about law is it may diagnose a problem, but it doesn't actually fix it. And in some cases, it may kind of make things worse. It's a bit like the forbidden fruit. You know, you say to a kid, don't do that, and of course they want to do it. So the law, and then he goes into this whole idea that the law actually makes you more aware how criminal you are. And it sets up this relationship with God where God is the judge. So we get into this whole idea of this kind of fearful God accountant in the sky who's keeping tally of all the things that we've done wrong. So he's saying basically that the law isn't the answer because we're just reminded how we can't do it and how broken we are. And then he develops this fascinating concept of God's promise and God's grace. And it's interesting that this grace idea was the match that lit the revolution of the Reformation. So it is a hugely radical concept that changed kind of, millions of people's idea about who they are. When Luther kind of rediscovered this letter to the Romans, and it was this letter that gave him a kind of theological fuel to change the relationship of the church and God. I want to talk a little bit about the word promise, because the lesson begins talking about God's promise. And there are two words in Greek for the word promise. Hypochesis, which means a promise which is entered into upon conditions, that I promise to do that if you do this. Okay? Paul uses a different interpretation in Greek, epalegia, which is a promise that is made out of the goodness of one's heart and made quite unconditionally. It is epagelia that Paul uses in describing the promise of God. God is loving his human children in the same way, with a love that makes him glad, and with some of us, with a love that makes him sad. But in either case, he will never let us go. It is not dependent on our merit or even our response to God's love. And that he describes as grace. Grace is always about something unearned and undeserved. We can never earn the love of God. It is a free gift, like life itself. So Paul pulls out this kind of new, fresh idea about how God loves us and this idea of the promise of Abraham to make his point that everybody is welcome under the tent of God, even Gentile Christians, and that we need to claim back Abraham for ourselves. And the argument is powerful. And religion, the Latin root of religion is to bind. Religio is binding like a rope, right? And so he sees that religion can bind us together in the same, we're all in this together, right? Abraham, we're all children of Abraham, we're all in this together. Or it can imprison us. You're bound like handcuffs. And so what he's doing, he's liberating the ancient Jewish story of Abraham and Sarah for everybody. We're in this together. So this is a central argument in how we feel about ourselves and our relationship to God, and how we feel about our group in the context of larger groups. And I want to put it in the context of the way we feel about being Americans, because then it puts what Paul was arguing about 2,000 years ago into maybe how we feel today. So the story goes something like this. I was visiting America for the first time. I was in my 26, 27, was with my partner, also from the UK, and we visited friends of ours in Berkeley, in California, and I was intrigued by, this is my first time in America, my best friend in college was here, ordained, married another Episcopal priest who was a woman priest, and after the visit, and it was the beginning of this kind of the sowing the seed that eventually I was going to move here and make this place my home. But Mary, the woman priest, said something that I've never forgotten. She said, it was clear that when you and Frank were here, Frank was on a vacation, but you were here looking for something else, and you were an American who happened to be born in Belfast. And it was very, her concept of being an American was not about being born here. It was something that was much, much larger. And we can interpret that about, freedom, following your dreams, working hard and being successful, all of that. But it was more than just being born here. It was almost kind of soul material. There was something, and you think about all of the families and the generations who have come here who maybe were Americans but didn't know it until they came here, and then created this thing, kept growing. And I think about that in the context of the debate with the Dreamers right now, right? And here you have the Dreamers are this, 800,000 kids who came here, are very much a part of American society. They are Americans. And they are the Gentile Christians that Paul is fighting for. And he's saying to the church in Rome, think differently about being Christians. We're all kind of in this together, and Abraham is ours. So he's widening the circle. And I think Paul's great gift is that he is the first universalist. He's got this image of a kind of humanity that's connected in this ancient story. And it's a beautiful story, but he claims it back because it was narrowed. In the same way that you see this happening in Poland. The Polish narrative is narrowing. The American narrative is narrowing. So we come to Jesus, our third character in the zigzag. Abraham, Sarah, Paul, the road bends, and now we come to Jesus. And the text for today is a really difficult text. That whole taking up your cross, denying yourself, it's not something I want to go and talk about on Franklin Avenue or at a cocktail party in Millbrook. It's a difficult text. And the reaction of Peter, I can understand Peter saying, enough of this suffering cross stuff, being rejected. No, you're on the right path. If we want to grow the movement, you got to stop talking like that. You got to be positive. And then Jesus said, get behind me, Satan, that you're thinking the way of the world, not the way of God. And many of us are like Peter because we want to project onto Jesus and God what we think they should do. Jesus healed this. Why doesn't Jesus, I was with a group of our confirmation kids last night, these kids that are on their journey and with the church and with Jesus, and they look at the world and they look at the church in the world and they're not impressed. Why doesn't God fix this? So I can understand Peter. Okay, Jesus, no, don't go that way. When we don't get what we want from Jesus, we stop believing, we stop going to church, we stop trying, we give up. And we think it's all baloney. So this is the God in my image syndrome. And there is no shortcut in dealing with these hard words in the gospel, to deny ourselves and take up a cross. And it's hard to teach that from a pulpit or to our teenagers who are not even sure about the Jesus thing. Denial, self-sacrifice. And I wanted to give a kind of different interpretation, and I found this helpful blog by another Episcopal priest called Father Mike. And his perspective on this text was really helpful to me. He says this: as long as we believe our life is about us, we will continue to exercise power over others, try to save ourselves, control our circumstances, and maybe even, like Peter, rebuke Jesus. Jesus rarely exercised power over others or tried to control circumstances. He simply made different choices. Self-denial is not about being out of control or powerless. It is about the choices we make. Jesus chose to give in a world that takes, to love in a world that hates, to heal in a world that injures, to give life in a world that kills. He offered mercy when others sought vengeance, forgiveness when others condemned, and compassion when others were indifferent. He trusted God's abundance when others said there was not enough. So with each choice, he denied himself and showed that God was in charge. It's a completely different take on denial that I found really helpful. And he goes on to say, at some point, those kinds of choices will catch the attention of and offend those who live and profit by power, control, and looking out for number one. They will not deny themselves. They will respond. Jesus said they would. He knew that he would be rejected by the elders, the priests, the scribes. It happens in every age for those who choose the path of self-denial. When it happened for Jesus, he made one last choice. He chose resurrection over survival. So, Abraham, Sarah, Paul, Jesus. Not a straight line, but a zigzag, dependent upon these ordinary human beings who find the courage and the insight to step out and respond to the grace and the love of God, out of their comfort zones and back into the light. So to paraphrase Father Mike, every time we choose to give in a world that takes, to love in a world that hates, to heal in a world that injures, to give life in a world that kills, we turn humanity in the right direction. When we offer mercy when others seek vengeance, forgiveness when others seek condemnation, open hearts with compassion when others are simply indifferent, we become Jesus in our present world. I think that's what the text is about today. We are sons and daughters of Abraham and Sarah. When we find the imagination to trust God's abundance while others around say scarcity, we become Jesus, denying ourselves, showing how God is present and in charge. Amen.